So let me just take a minute to introduce Jeff. I'll keep it brief because his resume is so long, and we all would much rather listen to him talking about stuff. I think I've known Jeff for about 30 years. I took a class from him as an undergrad, and obviously I've been following, like all of us have been, his influential work in a variety of different fields. And I'm delighted to see how much interest he's taken in this particular topic and helping to change the conversation. And I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say about robots, AI, and the macroeconomy. Good. Well, welcome, Jeff Sachs.
Thank you. Eric, thank you very much, and thanks to all of you. I'm not an expert in this topic, so I'm eager to hear thoughts here of people who are really working on the cutting edge of these issues. But I am thinking a lot about this, and so I want to share some reflections and then open it up for discussion. If I'm a little bit incoherent, I apologize. I was in China on Sunday, New York on Monday, the United Arab Emirates, in air on Tuesday, United Arab Emirates, Wednesday, Saudi Arabia yesterday, and I just arrived this morning. So I don't exactly know where I am. But, I made it with an hour to spare, even a moment to go to Starbucks, get a cup of coffee, so I might even wake up a little bit. So if I seem a little confused, it's a little more confused than usual. That will be my only.
What countries this weekend?
And then I am home for 2 days. Then Germany on Monday, and Waterloo Wednesday, Tuesday, Wednesday, home Thursday, and then Vienna over the weekend. So that's the damn problem of working for the UN. There are too many places, and they expect you actually to be there once in a while. You know.
Why leave the airport?
What's that?
Why leave the airport?
Exactly. I agree. Oh my God, the airports are getting worse and worse. So it's not fun, but it's fun to be here. So I do want to talk about with a group of experts some reflections on AI and the macroeconomy. My view is that this is a huge deal, and that this is as big a transformation and with as large social implications as any of the major waves of technology of the last 200 years. So we're engaged and already in the midst of very significant transformation. And like most major technological changes, I don't think that this one is fundamentally different in two ways. One is it raises productivity significantly, in my view, some of which we have measured, some of which we don't measure, some of which we will see, but the ability to get more goods and services out of our inputs, I believe, will soar on the basis of this. And second, it will fundamentally change income distribution, as have all major technological transformations. And probably in a way that's not so different from in the past in one regard, which is that our economy becomes ever more capital intensive. Modern economic growth. We started with an economy that was basically so much labor services that the labor theory of value was the predominant theory 200 years ago, and it made sense because most of the inputs to production were people doing basic physical labor. That's all going away, and that's already gone away substantially over the last century. Physical work in our country has largely disappeared, and I don't even regard what we do as work. This is a get-together. We get to talk to each other. They pay us for some reason, although who actually is paying us is an interesting question. And for what they're paying us is also an interesting question. But we're so far from work, what work used to be called, that even though we're classified by the BLS as working today, I think we're just having a chat. At some point, we won't even do this because our computers will do this, and we'll just meet at the coffee shop where there will be no baristas either, but there will still be coffee, which will have arrived magically in self-driving vehicles, and which will be brewed based on our iris scan, which tells the smart machine what our favorite coffee is, and we will automatically be debited on some electronic account, and we'll spend our days that way. That may still be called work, I don't know. But what I mean is that the technological transformations over the last 2 centuries have gone in the direction of increasing capital intensity and decreasing physical work and shifting income distribution. And the main shift is there's no market for physical labor, and that has already disappeared 50 years ago. And so incomes for physical work have been stagnant or declining now for decades. Probably the demands for a lot of what is considered cognitive work now will disappear the same way. Overall wages could decline significantly in the future because if there isn't real demand for labor input, that could go down. Even the coders in the room could find that they don't have jobs because smart machines will do smart coding as well, and it will be very hard to keep up with that. And then the basic question is, so what does all of that mean? And in general, the lesson of technology is it's good. It raises the quality of life. People that don't have it want it. That's a good telltale sign. I think all of these technologies will be hugely desired, but with an income distributional consequence that could be awful, absolutely awful. So it really could be that Larry Page owns everything in the end, and the rest of us own very, very little, or maybe will own something because we're a little bit ahead of the curve, but a large part of society will suffer massively unless there is redistribution of income. And the basic theorem of economics that I think is the relevant theorem here is that something which raises productivity potentially is Pareto improving. That, I would say, is the full stop, meaning that these technologies could raise well-being for everybody, but they won't raise well-being for everybody unless there is active income redistribution. Hence the interest now in basic income, universal basic income, or other kind of standards, transfers, and so forth. That's being rediscovered by this generation with a lot of names, but the basic idea that there should be shared income is, I would say, a mainstay of what used to be economic thinking before libertarianism took over, and should be part of our core economic thinking, again, because this kind of technological revolution absolutely has this property that it could be good for everybody, but it won't be good for everybody. In fact, it could be very bad for a lot of people, and so the focus on income distribution and redistribution becomes more and more central. There's a huge amount that's not known about all of the claims that I just made, how fast these technologies will change, what kind of skills, labor, jobs, tasks they will be complementary with, which kinds they will be substitutional. And I think there's a huge amount that is not known about the supply side of these technologies. One of the things that surprises me is how early dominant firms remain dominant over time, because my my ex ante expectation would be that there wouldn't be huge advantages to being Uber first because it seems so straightforward, actually. And Facebook seems invadable, and most of these technologies don't seem to have, didn't seem to me to have huge, impossible to scale barriers of entry. But it may be that big data is really so fundamentally at the core of these technologies, and access to massive information is really the currency of the new realm, that we end up with a few giants who really do own everything and control everything. And that raises another major set of questions.
So you point out that it could be Pareto improving, but it doesn't have to be.
Right.
And then you talk about, you just mentioned that, you know, the need for massive redistribution. Are you very pessimistic that there are ways of organizing our institutions and other things up front so that the income distribution could be more equitable through the market system rather than ex post? Maybe you'll get into that a little bit later.
So let me, I don't believe, there are several things I don't believe, and then I'll just show a few quick slides, and then we can talk, because I won't give a full lecture. I don't believe that this is a matter of choosing the direction of technology so that it's complementary to labor, for example. So there's one set of views, which is that our real challenge is to make sure that smart machines are working with people as opposed to substituting for people. I don't find that line of reasoning very compelling, I have to say. The idea that you get to choose that a technology is complementary rather than substitutable. That seems to me to be more inherent in the technology rather than in our choices. Second, I'm not very much persuaded about the central question of jobs. Jobs are key to the question of market income distribution. And so the issue of whether AI and robots create jobs or take away jobs at some level is interesting. But in general, I think there's much too much fixation on jobs per se, because people like the non-job part of their lives. They like leisure, they like their creative time, they like other things. And I think the whole history of modern economic growth is that we work less and less. We spend time in school till we're, in my case, 62. So I regard it as never having gotten out of grad school, basically. And then we spend a lot of time on real leisure. If you're lucky like we are, we spend a lot of time at leisure, which is called work, because we go to workshops and conferences and long summers and so forth, all classified as work. Then we have increasing time for leisure, which may be formally classified as retirement and so forth. So jobs, I think, are going down in the weight of time in our lives quite sharply. On the time use surveys, Americans over the age of 16 now average 3 hours, 10 minutes at work per day. That's pretty impressive that we can get a $60,000 per capita economy out of an average of 3 hours, 10 minutes of work for adults. Of course, a lot of people are in school, a lot of people are at home, a lot of people are in retirement in that survey, and that's why the average time of work is so short. Those at work are working an average of 7 hours in the survey. But we don't need most people, only about 40% of Americans are working on in any given day. And so that's going to be 20%, 10%. And that's okay. So that's the second thing that I don't think is crucial, this focus on jobs. What I do think is crucial is the focus on income distribution. And that's quite a different matter, because once one is done with the production, then the question of who reaps the benefit of this production is quite fundamental. And in places that are quite far advanced in digitization, in Northern Europe, for example, I was in Sweden and Norway 7 days ago, before China actually. So it started Norway, Sweden, China, New York, UAE, Saudi Arabia, MIT. But in Scandinavia, this income distribution issue is not a pressing issue. There are no Koch brothers there. There's no libertarians there. They're actually normal people. And they have the idea that everybody should get health care. Everybody should have education. Everybody should have free tuition. Everybody should have 6 weeks of vacation, by the way, paid. So they're already in the process of redistributing national income in an incredibly egalitarian way. Incidentally, our pre-tax Gini coefficient in the US is about, depending on which measures you use, I'd say something like 0.45 to 0.47, and our net of tax and transfer Gini is about 0.4 or 0.41. And in Scandinavia, the pre-tax Gini coefficient is maybe 0.4 rather than 0.47, so a little bit more equal. But the post-tax and transfer Gini coefficients between 0.25 and 0.3, because everybody gets the basic everything. And so they're already in an income distributional mode. As their work hours go down and down and down and down, they just share vacation time. Everybody has free access to education, free access to paternity and maternity leave, free access to paid vacation time, free access to retirement time. So they're already managing the reduction of work in an egalitarian way. David?
Yeah, I want to ask two comments. So two questions. So there's one is the labor income side, the other is the redistribution side. So my comments are on the labor income side. So, I mean, you made a point that, we don't get to choose whether the technology complements or substitutes. And I agree with that to a substantial extent. And I don't think there's any point in history where anyone has said, I want to create a technology to increase labor demand, right? All labor demand is derived demand. No one wants, if they can make their products out work for us, they'd be happy to do that. No one has intrinsic demand for workers. They want to get stuff done. So the irony is that although we've had 2 centuries of labor replacing technology, we haven't had a decline in labor demand, right? We had a decline in demand for certain skills and tasks, but labor share of national income, until recently was quite stable. Employment rates have risen, and then you say, well, they're sharing the work, working fewer hours, but is that a function of declining labor demand, or is that an income effect of people just choosing to take that higher income and work fewer hours per year and a smaller share of their adult lives? So on the labor income side, although I agree that no one is going to create machines with the goal of creating more demand for workers, or no one other than Eric and David and so on who are running to do that. That doesn't mean it won't happen anyway. That's historically what has happened despite the opposite intention.
I think the constancy of the labor share of income is almost a complete artifact of the data. In that if we separated human capital, labor income, and physical capital, we would see a tremendous change over time. And so I think that the idea that we've had a constant labor share is an accident, not a Cobb Douglas production function or complementarity of capital and labor. My view is that labor demand has plummeted in the 20th century, and what has gone up is demand for human capital, which is a heavy investment of time and effort, of course, in learning. And so here's my guess. I made up these numbers completely. This is not based on anything except my guess. And it's an appeal to the labor economists to actually make this calculation properly. We don't separate in the data human capital, and labor income. So the national income accounts combine the returns to schooling and the returns to work, to labor, I should say. We actually have at least three factors of production: human capital, labor, and physical capital. Of course, now we're going to have to separate kinds of physical capital, or it'll be software and physical capital, and it will be raw labor, manual labor, for example, and various kinds of embodied skills, which is roundabout technology through learning and education. And my guess is that in 1900, half of GDP was raw labor. Most people were still on the farm or doing physical manual labor in cities. And maybe of the other 50%, 25% was physical capital and 25% was human capital. By now, we're probably something like this: roughly a third labor, a third human capital, and a third physical capital. So there's been some increase in the capital share in the national accounts, maybe from a quarter to a third. You know, when I was going to school 40 years ago, the coefficient on labor was 0.25. Now was 0.75 in the Cobb-Douglas production function. Now you would put it maybe at 0.6 or 0.65, because the measured share of capital has gone up. But what's really gone up, of course, is the returns to human capital. And the earnings of pure labor input have plummeted. The real wages have gone down probably for physical work, maybe 20% in real terms. And the amount of raw labor deployed in the economy has plummeted also. So the share of income accounted for by what I would call labor as opposed to skills has probably gone from half to a third. And my guess is that 2050 will look something like this, although physical capital is probably the wrong word. By that I mean hardware and software might take 2/3 of the total, and then maybe a sixth divided between labor and human capital. I think human capital is going to experience the sharpest declines over the next period. The idea that we have skill-machine complementarity is probably not any longer true with smart machines.
But there's no evidence of that so far,
right?
I mean,
no evidence. I don't know. The evidence is in particular sectors. We don't need lawyers anymore. We don't need paralegals anymore. I don't think there.
But we've had 100 years of rising return to higher education.
Right.
So, I mean, it could turn down.
Yeah.
There's no question of it.
Has it leveled off in the past decade?
You know, it's grown less rapidly, but hasn't fallen, right? And we've
More or less
increased supply
flat
over that time.
Yeah.
And in fact, and among the most educated workers, continue to rise among people with post-college education. So, I mean,
but college is kind of already showing its wear and tear.
College, you know, the college premium has been flat. You know, part of that is composition, right? A lot of that is, you know, people went to for-profit colleges. It's hard to say, but I mean, but you know, there is a deceleration in the measured demand for human capital in the United States starting in 1992. It actually has not decelerated further since that time, and that's an unexplained puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
So the only point I'm making is, you know, I can imagine the possibilities you're saying, but there's so far not evidence to support that has already underway.
Right. I think in general, what I love about the work you guys are doing, and I think it is important for us as economists, speaking for the economic side, our field is not very good at focusing on specific technologies and looking forward. You know, we're very much black box field, so everything is some kind of flexible functional form production function rather than the specifics of technologies. I think here we have the makings of such a huge change that understanding the actual specifics of the technologies as best as is possible is a very important piece of the work program. Now, my guess is, the reason I put this picture up, my guess is that for the first time, a lot of very skilled work will be taken over by smart machines. And that's different, because what machines have done up until now has replaced, the main thing machines have done in the 20th century was eliminate physical labor for most things, actually, aside from still, the parts where you have to flexibly carry things on a construction site and so on. But even those are now, the whole work process is being redesigned in fundamental ways that machines can do a lot of that. We don't need miners. We won't have any miners in the future. We don't have any farmers anymore, basically. The farmers that I talk to say that they still like to sit on their tractors, but they look backwards. They don't drive. The tractors put on all the fertilizer. They don't do anything anymore, but they're still wistful, so they sit on the tractor and spend the afternoon going back and forth on their farmland, but they're not needed anymore. So that's the first phase that was eliminated. But my view is at least 3/4 of what I do can be done better by a machine. And by that, I mean all the research that I do. I can't keep up with anybody's articles anymore, but a machine could, because smart machines will be able to read the 20,000 journals and will get the keywords and will understand the context and will be able to write the papers faster. And so I think that a lot of the research actually is going to go the way of let the machines search through the web and understand what's out there, who's finding what's being learned, because it's really hard. There are too many journals now, too many good articles, all very interesting, but we need bots that are going out and finding all this stuff. And don't you think that this is within reach in 20 years? I do. I think it's probably coming quite quickly. We know we don't need paralegals anymore. That's, one point that's already come. How many people believe we'll have radiologists in the future? Basically, they're not needed, because what they do is they scan. And of course, we need people to train the machines. But almost every 2 months now, there's a new cover story of Science or Nature about being able to read imaging better than the experts that read imaging. So my view is that a lot of the advanced degrees is cognitive processing of information that now reinforced learning will be able to replace. That's great. Who wants to slog through 200 journals to find things when the machine can do it for you? So I'm happy to have more leisure time. I just want to own the robot that does it. That's my main point.
Can I make two objections? So, imagine, 50 years ago, we were having a discussion about what empirical work would look like, in the computer age. And said, well, basically, since all of empirical work is spent in, inverting matrices and writing out tables by hand and drawing graphs, basically empirical work will take no time anymore, because it'll all be done by machines, right? But obviously that's not what happened. It's become much more time intensive. It's just that our time is allocated to the harder stuff, right? To actually running experiments, to figuring out, better ways to answer questions with unlimited computing power. Computing power is almost never a constraint for any of the research.
That's correct. Yeah.
So, again, it would be a case where we would have dramatically overstated the degree of substitution and understated the degree of complementarity that actually occurred. So I don't, I understand where the efficiencies come from, but I feel like history, when we're looking forward, we always see one thing, and looking back, we've always seen the opposite of what we would have anticipated, or not the opposite,
right?
Kind of more a better predictor of what happens next than has science fiction in this realm. So I mean, I think we should at least be humbled by that a bit. And the other is, you keep saying, our time has become, or somehow our labor is sort of, it's, we just live like leisure lives, not work lives.
Yeah.
But all of us feel ourselves to be busier and busier. And I think, I think this sense of the opportunity and cost of time rising, right, is a kind of a fact of modern life, which would suggest that there's actually increasing scarcity of time, not decreasing.
I don't agree with that. For me, what I really feel, I spend a lot of time in poor countries, and the main thing you feel in low-income countries is physical work. People are physically exhausted. And the main thing that they see for us is we don't do that kind of work. I really don't feel, I don't want to tell the president of my university this too loudly, but I don't feel what I do is work. I feel it's.
Well, I mean, we have special jobs.
I feel it's very curiosity driven.
So I'm sort of
I
surprised.
like being paid a lot for it, but most of my time is spent in coffee shops or on an airplane and so on. Yes, we're busy because it's exciting. It's curious. We're curious. We get paid well for it. But I don't think that somehow. I think the basic truth is that the amount of time we spend at what 50 years ago would have been called work has plummeted. We don't classify it that way, but the point I'm arguing is we really are in a period of sharply declining labor input in general. And just to finish one point, Americans average 1,700 hours a year at work. Germans, 1,300 hours a year at work. Swedes, 1,400 hours, I'm rounding. But basically, we're several weeks. The countries that share better, that are, more social, democratic ethos, are already working 6 to 9 weeks less than we are in the measured accounts. And that's already, to my mind, they're the countries of the future anyway, because that's really the direction. So try calling a Swede anytime between July 1 and September 1. You might get them on their boat in the archipelago outside of Stockholm, which is great. If you call them during the winter, you'll get them at a coffee shop or at a sauna if you can find them. So that, I do think, is really what has happened substantially. So we're busy, but I don't think we're busy because there's actually, I don't know.
Well, I'm surprised two economists debating about what the value of labor, how it's changed, talking about how busy you feel or how much time. I mean, wouldn't a good metric be what people are willing to pay for an hour of labor? And hasn't that grown for a couple hundred years and then flattened in the past? For median wages, they've been sort of flat for maybe 20 years or so. And
for manual work, it's been going down.
And for manual work, it's been going down.
Years.
So and one of the key lessons from that is that different groups have seen very different changes. And so that the question maybe isn't what's happened to labor as a lump, but that certain types of labor seem to be much less valuable now than they were in the past. The median is flat at best, and then some people, I mean, have seen soaring levels of labor. Wouldn't that be the most direct way to see what's happened to the value of labor?
Sure. I mean, that's a very traditional way to do it, right? I mean, we've been looking at the rising return to skill forever.
Well,
right,
no, but yeah, exactly. We've seen it panning out.
The shared national
There's a chart that I use in almost every talk now that you've produced of
things
how
are panning out, and the bottom line of that
yeah, exactly. You're saying what I'm going to say. The bottom line on that for people with high school or less than high school has been falling for like 30 plus years. So that would be and that didn't happen in the first part of the 20th century, right?
I mean,
so isn't that very consistent with Jeff's
I mean, it would be
point there.
uncontroversial to say that if you took the labor force of the turn of the 20th century and brought them into the 21st century without, giving them literacy and numeracy skills, many of them would be unemployable. So
We know that,
right,
because they
absolutely.
are
So that part you
unemployed.
agree on.
They've dropped out of the labor
Of
And
force.
then the median is flat. Do you agree on that?
Yeah, it's been relatively flat. I mean, so.
And it used to rise.
But I think the question is, to say that the return to raw labor has fallen is uncontroversial, right?
Right.
Absolutely true. The question I think people have, I think a more conventional way of thinking.
And I would say the returns to having high school
Sure.
has
it's been
plummeted in the last 30
as
years.
Tim Burton said, there's a race between education and technology.
Right.
Technology is increasing the value of skills, diminishing the value of unskilled work.
Right.
Education is trying to keep up. In general, so when people say AI is going to fully devalue human labor, they're going to say they're saying education will lose that race. Not that if we stop educating. So the statement that if we stopped educated, we would lose that race, that's a given, right? So but you're making a statement that regardless of what we do, we're obsolete.
No, well, I'm making
If we can turn
a couple
that
of
means we'll be
observations. I'm making another observation, which is that we don't have, as far as I know, a good mapping of work time over the last century. But the usual argument that new kinds of work has always arisen is false. What I think has happened is that a tremendous part of our life has now gone into other areas. One is education. Second is non-work time per se. Retirement is an invention, of course, of the 20th century.
You could argue that it matters if that's an income effect or a substitution effect, right? It matters if we're working less because we're wealthy, so we choose to work less, or there's just as
Well,
less
it
need
matters
for us.
to an extent, but it also says that the future, in my view, is less and less. I don't think we have to worry so much about whether we find jobs to replace the machines. That's the point I'm making. That can be both income and substitution effects. The jobs will replace human input, and we don't have to worry so much about will there be new jobs to compensate. We should understand that what will compensate is less human time in the economy. And I think that's been a huge trend. I can't get the data exactly. It would take a large effort, but you have the sense that in 1900, people basically physically able people over the age of 16 worked from morning till night.
Sure, and they worked until death as well. I mean,
Yes, and they worked until death. And so
Right.
so it's true. I think the whole thing is a huge income effect in one way, that the machines will do our work and we'll want them to do our work, is my point.
But there's a
But
difference
this question of whether investing more and more in education indeed keeps whether the demand curve for skilled work is going to continually shift out. I'm skeptical of that.
But that's the crucial question, right? So
That's a crucial
because
question.
it's the question is, could you actually survive on income from human capital, right? So if you're, one thesis is labor share goes to zero no matter what we do,
Right.
and so it's all about redistributing your rents on capital. Another is that actually you're born with a lump of labor. If you invest in it, as long as you continue to make the right investments, actually your earnings can rise in real terms and keep pace with capital, actually, such that the labor share stays relatively constant. And that has worked for 100 years.
Wait. The lump of labor fallacy is not a fallacy.
No, I didn't mean lump of labor in this lump of labor fallacy.
No. But what I mean by that is you have to invest really, really heavily
Sure.
to keep ahead. It's not that all boats are being lifted by this rising tide of productivity. If you just stop at high school, you're a goner now. If you stop basically at a BA, you're pretty much have stagnant income or falling income. So it may be true that if you have both the intrinsic wherewithal and the ability to invest in 8 years of post-high school education, you can keep up with the falling labor demand. That may be true. Maybe it will be 12 years after that. But I don't think we're just standing still. That getting a BA, it's not, my guess is it's not even as good as it was 20 years ago, and probably for identifiable reasons. And now we're going to see large blotches of areas, which are basically, I think radiology is probably the easiest case to see because it's largely pattern recognition, which is what machine learning does better and better now. Where you're going to have large classes of that highly skilled work basically taken out of labor demand. And the idea that it just substitutes, that always something else arises, I'm saying is not true. It doesn't arise at the same level of investment in skills, definitely not. And second, one major way that we adjust is less work time, is what I'm saying. So that, and that's good, at least I think, that people will not work 1,700 hours. If all of this pans out, they'll work 1,000 hours on average.
But I mean, more educated people work many more hours than they used to.
I'm
Right?
sorry?
So in the 1970s, the locus between hourly wages and hours per year was relatively flat. Low-wage people didn't work less, and high-wage people only worked a little bit more. Now it's completely, it looks like a ski slope. Highly skilled people work many, many more hours than they used to, and less educated people work fewer hours. And both of those are effectively labor demand phenomenon, right? Or yeah.
Well, so two things. One, I think he's on. I think you're on about slide 4.
Almost
so
done.
I want to give you a chance to get that, and then we had this discussion. But just a quick point that sort of goes against the income effect and towards the labor substitution effect, right?
I think right. So I think there's a real concern. My concern is at the falling demand for less educated workers.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And
So it's not. That's not an income effect.
No,
I
that's
wonder,
not all income.
But David, I also wonder whether it's really true that more skilled people work more, because it may be that you log more hours, but the nature of the work is less work, I would say, in the sense of more time.
There's very few really physically demanding, dangerous jobs anymore. So by that, even the low-skilled workers are working, right? Their rate of occupational death and injury,
right?
It's just dramatically down. So I don't know if I want to count it to say that because you say it's not as unpleasant, it's not work.
Well, I think it's really a blurred line because, again, what people are actually doing with their time, it's true. It's somebody's paying for it for the moment.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure that that's going to last that way.
That's the question.
And a lot of what's being paid for seems to me to be rents to the machines rather than real. I mean, it's part of our overall compensation in a way that probably is not going to last in this way. So okay, let me make one more point. What's the basic macroeconomics look like in a world that I'm describing? In a world in which machines do better, are more productive, but lower the demand for labor. And this is something that Seth and I have worked on, and that I'm trying to understand. What's the dynamic if it's really true that machines can replace basically what we do? And of course, I'll start again with the most basic economic theory. If the machines are better, and they get better at replacing all kinds of human activity, it is perfectly logical, I mean, consistent. You can write an economic model in which wages go down, returns to capital go up, and output as a whole goes up, so that you have a shift of income distribution from labor to capital broadly overall. And that can reach limits of wages tending towards zero and capital tending towards the entire economy. what's the welfare effects of that? The welfare effects of that are quite straightforward in that the social possibilities are improved. So it is potentially Pareto improving to have this kind of transformation, because if you were asked the choice, do you want smart machines or dumb machines? And smart machines destroy demand for labor, and dumb machines do not. The answer should be we want smart machines, as long as we have the choice of how the output, who owns the machines in essence, or how the output is distributed, or who gets to tax the income. That's a meta theorem. You want more as long as you're able to redistribute. If you put this in a simple overlapping generations framework, it is interesting that since the old tend to own the machines and the young tend to own the labor, it's easy to see why in an overlapping generations framework, if you have a machine shock of a deep mind revolution, and that diminishes the demand for labor and it raises the returns to the machines, the old generation benefits and the young generation gets hurt. Then you can ask the question, what do the old do with their windfall? And the simplest model is they consume it. And in that kind of model, then you can show that one generation is made better off by this shock, and it can logically be the case that all future generations are made worse off by the shock. So it is not only not Pareto improving, it is actually immiserizing, even though it is a true, pure productivity increase.
So
that's
future
logically.
Generations are made worse off because there's no more capital?
Because the young just come into the world with their labor, and the old eat their labor, and the young, they can invest in the robots, but they basically have very little to sell, so they own very little.
So so the pie is smaller overall?
The pie ends up being smaller.
But that also brings the capital investment actually goes down over time. So it's an initial surge where the elderly or the old buy capital, and then they eat all their seed corn, and then the young are sort of.
Basically, the young start out fresh. They come into the world. There's no demand for the young, and so whatever they do, they scrape by.
So there's actually capital decumulation in the
yes,
capital.
exactly.
Right.
That is perfectly natural. Amy? So the x-axis is periods in this little illustration. So I was just going to elaborate for the next step. You could imagine that parents help their kids, and that another possibility is intrafamilial, intergenerational transfers. And so another kind of logical outcome is that parents that have big windfalls on their capital income give some income to their children because they see their children don't have a future, so they tell the kids, you can live at home. And we know you don't have a job, but we're going to give you free housing. And so that is a way that the benefits can be redistributed across time. It's also possible, and I made a little illustration of this perfectly logical possibility, though not a necessity, that you have start out, say, with rich households and poor households, and by nature of the bequest function or the inter vivos transfer function, there's a certain threshold below which you don't make transfers or bequests, but richer households do make transfers and bequests. That seems to be consistent with the data. And if you rig the utility function in that way, and you start out with rich households and poor households, what happens is that the poor households, maybe the older generation has a tiny windfall, but they don't have much capital net worth to begin with. Their kids are immiserized because, shit, there's no demand for labor anymore. Whereas with the richer households, you have a big windfall, and they give the bequest to the young, and it turns out that the new equilibrium is a higher bequest every generation. And so the rich households end up better off for all future generations. The poor households, the older of the poor households in the first generation of the shock, are slightly improved perhaps, but their children are made worse off, and the income inequality widens. The rich do quite well by this through intrafamilial transfers, and the poor are immiserized. To my mind, that is a plausible description of what's happening right now, especially if you view capital in the way that I'm arguing, add the human capital to the physical capital. Raw labor has been hit hard. Poor households can't finance the human capital accumulation of their children, and they choose not to, whether they can or not. Rich households pass some of the returns to their children, and you have a widening of income inequality and a pure immiserization of the poor households because their labor endowment has lost its value. Again, the meta theorem is everybody can be made better off compared to the pre-shock trajectory, but it requires redistribution of income. And if the natural bequest motive doesn't do the job because you have poor households who don't give the bequests, then you have to tax the rich households. And you tax the older generation with their windfall, and you give some of that income to the poor. You could call it basic income. You could call it taxing the robots, though that is a kind of naive way to put it. But the idea is that you tax the wealth and the windfall, and you make the transfer to the now poor workforce endowed with raw labor. So that's the end of my story on this. I think we're likely to see a tendency, if we don't do any redistribution of income, a widening of income inequalities, an absolute immiserization of a significant part of the population as a result of what should be societal-wide benefits. And if we took the view that this is a social windfall, not a personal windfall, we could make everybody better off. And to my mind, again, my vision of life, I have to say it was a little bit informed by going to visit the gorillas in Rwanda, because I saw the Garden of Eden. When you go there, the gorillas are not working. They're sitting around. There's occasional sex. The kids and their parents are playing. They eat the fruit when they want to. And that is my guess of what life was like in the Garden of Eden before we were expelled to the hard toil and labor. And maybe the story of Genesis is the story of the Holocene era and the invention of agriculture, that there was a latent, nascent social memory of us as hunter-gatherers who used to work 2 or 3 hours a day plucking berries and nuts. And then suddenly we all found ourselves working round the clock, round the year, trying to survive in agriculture, which was a miserable transition for humanity. And what we're trying to do is go back to life before agriculture. We've almost succeeded in the United States. We're down to 1% of the population in agriculture. We're down to 0.5% in mining. We'll eliminate all the rest of the physical labor. We'll count whatever the rest we do some way, but it really will be sitting in the coffee shop. And the rest of the world is desperate to have the same thing. And by the way, I should just add, from a development point of view, this is all disastrous, because what poor countries have as their endowment is raw labor. They don't have rich benefactors who are transferring capital to them. they just have raw labor. So this makes the development process terribly, terribly difficult, because the usual path to development is sell your raw labor, cutting and stitching garments that are now cut and stitched by machines, growing food, which is now grown by mechanized machinery, being miners, which now is done by machines. And so people migrate, they get shot, they sink in the Mediterranean. But I think that there's probably a development issue here that's pretty profound also, which is a lot of the world only has the endowment of raw labor right now. Let me say the optimistic counterpart of that, which is the part that I don't have in here in thinking about this well, is that the marginal cost of these technologies is zero. And so the opportunity for mass benefits everywhere is also profound. And what I think needs to be thought about a lot is not only the redistribution of income, but the supply side of the AI economy, who owns it, and how it is shared. Because maybe it's not only the sharing of, maybe if all of the supply side is basically free, because it's just software that can be hacked, stolen, replicated, copied, then even poor countries would be able to have the benefit of it and somehow get into this business if it doesn't require huge outlays of physical capital. So that's as far as I've gotten my thinking about the story.
Great. Let's take some questions. Right here. Yeah.
So we equate the seemingly understandably working jobs.
Yes.
And the Paleolithic societies, you would say 600 years ago, 1,000 years ago, seemed quite instrumental to society. Even seems now that doing work that is locally meaningful and adds value from a subjective perspective is what allows humans to function well. And we have a fair amount of research now about sort of the non-working populace morbidity on a number of dimensions, increasing psychological as well as physical. So it seems to me like, how are you thinking about the non-instrumental benefits or requirements of work societally to continue society remaining functional?
I'm not thinking enough about it yet. It's a very real question about meaning of life, what are we doing, how are we spending our time, and so on. My view is that when machines do a lot of what we're classifying as work right now, or as jobs, whatever you want to call it, we will have more time on our hands to do creative things, even to be nice to each other, and have more different and creative kinds of lives, because the grunt work is being done by the machines.
So I would classify.
And that is, of course, what Keynes worried about in 1930 fundamentally. How are we going to spend our time? When I look at societies that I think are 20 years ahead of us in this, like Sweden, they're not in angst, actually, about the fact that they're spending a tremendous amount of time in leisure and in non-work activity, and spending much more time with their young kids and other things. It's still an open question, but they have gone several hundred hours a year less, and so far no social crisis. They're happier than we are, according to best evidence.
So then I would just describe your classification maybe unnecessarily constrained.
Okay.
Creation of ideas, art, relationships, all of these things. This is part of what I think you're paid for.
Right.
And we're paid for. And I would call that knowledge work, maybe artistic work. Anytime you have to develop capacity, introducing an output of value, I think it's more useful to sort of classify that as work.
Good. I take the point.
Hi, Mark.
So I think that
more or less get the intuition of the overlapping generations at the same time. The young, their income goes down, so they cannot invest in capital anymore, and so they stay poor forever. I want to know whether there's some evidence for that, because, for example, if you look at a company like Google, the average age of employees are young. The young, they typically go into these higher paid jobs. They don't go into manufacturing. So I wonder whether there's some evidence for your overlapping generations model that you don't worry losing out and no longer.
Well, there's a lot of evidence that America has become a two-track society with a fundamental divide at the bachelor's level. So households where the parents don't have a bachelor's degree are very unlikely to raise kids that get a bachelor's degree. And if you don't have a bachelor's degree, you're very unlikely to be above the waterline. And it's getting worse, I would say, in many social dimensions for that 50% or more of the population. And we're kind of stuck, especially because of our weird social policies in this country, which are the least generous imaginable of any rich country, where we've kind of maxed out over the last generation at about 35% bachelor's completion. And it does come to the question, I'm on David's side on this, that I'd rather give free tuition and try to reach 50% bachelor's degrees in the country, because I think lives will go better with that, and that's a crucial income distributional choice for us to make, pretty easy one, that we should be making. We should not have $1 trillion of student debt, and most of this on kids that can't even finish their degree because they drop out halfway through because they're crushed by the debt. So I think the overlapping generations model is actually right, that it helps to explain this increasingly tracked country. And it's very hard, it's hard and getting harder to get out of the lower rungs of the income distribution. And there's a lot of evidence of that. So in that sense, I think the intuition works.
One more question. I have a question.
Yeah.
Or is there someone there? Okay. So you mentioned on the production side that maybe there's zero marginal cost, and so the good news is, we can just distribute them, but they're high fixed costs, and there's a assumption there that even if nobody puts any effort in, that these AI tools will generate an enormous amount of wealth. A libertarian or someone on the other side would probably argue we really need to provide incentives for people to be entrepreneurial and think of new things that these machines can do and create wealth that they won't do it on their own. And so we need to keep a portion, if we tax those returns, that's going to discourage people from putting those same level of investments in. How would you respond to that?
First, on taxation, there's a lot to say on the specifics of taxation. You can tax consumption, you can tax savings in effect, you can tax the returns to capital, and there are, I think, in general, good reasons to look for more consumption type taxes rather than taxes on saving or on capital per se.
But wouldn't they all have the same incentive effect?
Slightly different. They don't necessarily have the same incentive effects on the margin, on rates of return, and on returns to R&D and so forth. So I think there's a detailed discussion about the tax, exactly the forms of taxation. And when Gates said to tax robots, it's a kind of sloppy sentence, but it's a sentiment that makes sense in what he's rightly saying is we should tax, since society is generating a bigger surplus overall, we should be taxing that surplus to redistribute income. So he's right about that. But the idea of literally levying it on robots is, I think, more metaphorical than a useful answer. So I don't have a specific tax model, whether it's a progressive consumption tax, which could be implemented, a wealth tax on the old,
But let me rephrase the question a little bit. Would a tax change the total size of the pie in such a way that there would be a somewhat smaller pie that would be redistributed? Is there some optimal level where between having it having it taxed or not taxed at all?
Yeah. Everything about the economics of information requires a deeper understanding of the returns to R&D. Okay, so everything on the supply side of this new technology requires its own categories of analysis, because information is not a normal competitive good that can be analyzed like other kinds of commodities, other kinds of goods and services. So since we're in the middle of a technological revolution, I think, again, a meta theorem is we should probably be subsidizing it in some way, not taxing it, because there probably are social returns to this information that are not easily appropriated by the individual inventors. So that's a meta theorem that government should be investing in R&D. MIT is the quintessential example of that, because our society has invested in MIT for the last 75 years, and I'd say gotten a damn good return out of it. And so that's a general proposition that I would say. You don't tax the R&D. You recognize in general non-appropriability. Here, but one thing that militates against this is, or not against it, but I think is an interesting add-on, is that machine learning in particular has one critical feature which is very interesting, that is a huge barrier to entry, and that is the access to massive training data. And so what makes Google or Facebook or Amazon or Apple the natural progenitors of machine learning is not that they have the best programmers, but that they have the biggest big data. And so I think that there's something quite interesting in that, that we should also be thinking about, because those might be huge barriers to entry. And what these companies have done is, without any adequate public discussion, they've taken all our information. They know more about us than we do by far. They can predict my behavior better than I can predict my behavior. They call me every time some purchase comes up and says, did you make that purchase? No, we didn't think so either. You don't buy things like that. So that's a credit card. We'll take it off your credit card. So they already know all of that stuff. And we never had a social debate about that. It's been pure appropriation, and the way our political system is designed, it's designed never to discuss such things, because there's big money involved in it. Big money we don't discuss in polite company in the United States. So that, I think, is a huge issue. In general, we should be subsidizing. We did subsidize Sergey Brin and Larry Page, and then they so nicely put all their IP in Bermuda, so they never have to pay any taxes on this ever again. And that we should stop for sure, because that's the opposite of what this model is saying. This model, at a minimum, is saying if you get mega rich out of this, you need to contribute to those who are absolutely losing, not even to avoid your basic income taxation, which is what all of our big companies are tax evaders. of course, with the contrivance of the IRS, but they're all, in my view, massive frauds on the tax side because they put all their IP offshore, even though it's all good old American made IP, paid for in America, made in America, and it should be taxed in America too. And so that is another piece of the puzzle.
Well, thanks very much, Jeff. We're sorry we're out of time here, but this was
Thanks for
very
the chance for
provocative. A couple quick announcements. On April 5th, we have Michael Zhang coming in from Hong Kong. So that's on It is on Wednesday, but just to keep you guys on your toes, we're going to move it to a different room, E62 687, so upstairs, and then we go back on our regular Wednesday schedule with Avi Goldberg, John Van Reenen, and Martin Booth.